This podcast is a production of Widener Law Commonwealth in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. For more information, visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu/podcast.
Hello and welcome to Widener Law Commonwealth's podcast. I'm your host, Tara Mead. When you think about environmental leadership and sustainability, one person on our campus quickly comes to mind. Professor John Dernbach, who serves as the director of Widener Law Commonwealth's Environmental Law and Sustainability Center. Throughout his career, he has been a sought-after environmental law expert, both nationally and internationally, and is also the author of several books, including his most recent publication designed to help lawyers incorporate sustainability into their law practice. Professor Dernbach was also recently honored by the Pennsylvania Environmental Council with the Curtin Windsor Award for his long-standing diligence and commitment to environmental leadership. Today, he joins us to discuss his work, including his trip to Egypt to take part in this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP27, which was last month. And he'll also be talking about his work, including his newest book, and, in case you weren't aware, his retirement later in 2023 and what plans he may have for the future. Professor Dernbach, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
And speaking of opportunities, you and I had the chance to briefly chat the day that you returned from your COP27 trip, and it sounded as if that conference was very successful. Now, I realize it wasn't your first year participating in the conference, but can you talk about it, how it went this year, how it was different than in previous years, and what you were able to accomplish?
I went this year to gather with Tracy Hester of the University of Houston Law School to the Conference of the Parties on behalf of the American Bar Association. Last year at COP26 in Glasgow, he and another lawyer, Chris Carr, represented the American Bar Association to make preliminary contacts with members of other bar associations. Our idea last year was to begin a conversation with members and leaders of other bar associations in other countries to try to begin a sort of an international conversation about what bar associations can do to foster climate-conscious lawyering. As a result of last year's work, this year I was able to gather with Tracy Hester to formal events, side events at COP27, where we represented the Bar Association, the American Bar Association, and talked about what the Bar Association has been doing, what the Bar Association plans to do to foster climate-conscious lawyering. We were there with the Brazilian Bar Association, the Law Society of England and Wales, the International Bar Association, and members and representatives from other bar associations, including Zimbabwe, Zambia, and other countries. And what we were able to do with these events, there were events over 3 different days. What we were able to do with these events, I think, was to elevate the role of bar associations in terms of thinking about what should lawyers do. Mm-hmm. The most basic, obvious point about this is that there's 1.3 million lawyers in the United States alone who are practicing law. They counsel clients on a wide variety of activities, land use, business development, emissions control, project development, all manner of things. And the question is what would happen if more of those lawyers integrated greenhouse gas reduction and energy efficiency into their client counseling work? How would clients actually behave differently if they did more of that? And obviously there's all sorts of questions about what you tell clients and what you don't tell clients and all the rest of that. But our thought is that we're looking right now at implementation. We have a pretty good idea of what we need to do. The Paris Agreement in 2015 basically would have countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by about 2050. And we talk a lot about governments implementing these reductions, but there's a large question going on about what everyone else ought to be doing as well. Mm-hmm. What is the role of the private sector, including what is the role of lawyers? So that's what we went to do and to talk about. We certainly elevated the conversation. We had some very robust conversations with significant leadership from bar associations being represented. And our plan next year is to do more bar associations, more reporting on specific things that we've been able to do, and more ambitious plans for the future.
I think it's really interesting that you're taking this perspective, you and others that have taken part in this conference, to look at the role of bar associations and attorneys as it concerns, the environment and sustainability. It's not something that most people, when they think about the environment, they don't automatically think about, okay, what role can an attorney or a bar association play? So that sounds like quite a bit of a game changer.
It could be. Yeah, it could be a game changer. Our thought process, I guess, is that the climate issue is not limited just to environmental lawyers or energy lawyers. If you do supply chain work for a tractor supply company, just to pick a random example, that work involves or could involve questions about the greenhouse gas emissions of your suppliers, what they do for energy efficiency, what they do for toxic and hazardous pollution of various kinds. And you can build requirements like that into supply chain agreements, and a lot of companies have been doing that, and a lot of lawyers have been doing that. But there's a lot more work to be done in that particular area. And a tractor supply company might decide to do that for all kinds of reasons. It might decide to do that for risk management or risk reduction purposes. It might do that for reputational purposes. It might do that to stay out of legal trouble. It might do that to help attract young employees who really care about this. There's a variety of reasons that a company might decide to do that. And a lawyer can put those reasons in front of the client and help the client think about whether that's something that the client should consider doing.
That's really, really interesting. And I know that being involved in COP27 is not the only international conference that you've been involved in. I know you've been involved in other national and international environmental efforts during your quite sizable career. So are there any that stand out to you the most that you'd like to share?
In 1992, the United Nations held a conference in Rio de Janeiro. It was the UN Conference on Environment and Development. It's called the Earth Summit. And at that conference, countries decided to endorse something called sustainable development. The idea of sustainable development is it's not just a new clever name for environmental protection. It's about taking environmental protection and integrating it, incorporating it with economic development and job creation and social well-being generally. It's about how to build environmental quality into a project that we've all kind of agree is a good project, which is to improve human quality of life by making sure that social, economic conditions are good, and even that and it's all anchored on peace and security. But what we've learned, what happened going into the 1992 Earth Summit is countries were beginning to say, this project of economic and social development looks pretty good to us in so many ways. People are living longer, the economy has grown, people are better educated, all that sort of thing. But the environment is in a really bad place, and it's getting worse. And if we don't attend to that, everything else we care about is at risk.
Yeah, it's going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, it's going to. Yeah, and so what you need to do to ensure, if you will, the human project or human progress, what you need to do is protect and restore the environment on which everything else depends at the same time that you do this stuff. Now, typically, historically, the way the development project has worked is we say, hey, there's an economic development project, let's go do it, let's build it out, and we'll deal with the environment stuff at some point or another. We'll build a highway, we'll build a factory, and we'll deal with the environment some way or another.
It's almost like an afterthought. Let's not worry about it.
It's not almost like an afterthought. It is an
really
afterthought.
Is, right?
Yeah, it is actually an afterthought. So the idea is building the environment into the decision-making process for this other stuff. That's sustainable development. Now, in 1992, I went down, I took a week off from my job at the Department of Environmental Resources and went down to Rio de Janeiro, and it was a really interesting experience. And later, when I came back and started teaching here, I started thinking, well, okay, what is this sustainable development thing? How does that work? And I started thinking hard about what the UN text said and what the background and context was, and I made a project out of thinking about and writing about what the U.S. ought to be doing on sustainable development. And I've done quite a lot of writing about that, and part of my thought process is built on my own experience at the Department of Environmental Resources in Pennsylvania, now the Department of Environmental Protection. I was in the Bureau of Regulatory Counsel, and I worked on a lot of regulatory programs. And what I found on my second or third day on the job was that you could not talk about environmental protection without also talking about economic development and jobs. You could not do it.
You couldn't just keep it in its own silo. Everything was interconnected.
Well, because every time you made an effort to protect the environment, somebody would push back and would say, this is going to hurt my business, this is going to cost jobs.
Okay, yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
So if you care about the environment, and this would be my message to, this is what I learned, but it would also be my message to anyone listening, you can't really do that effectively unless you're also and expect to be heard or expect to get anything done if you're not also paying attention to economic development and job creation. So we worked on a lot in the laws that I helped draft when I was there in the waste and mining programs, was how to make environmental protection work together with economic development and social well-being and job creation. How do you do all of those things at the same time? And what I found was that when you do that, it's actually easier to get stuff done. It's easier to get laws passed because a lot of the opposition that you might otherwise face goes away. You figured out a way to solve the problem that somebody has with the cost of the regulation. You figured out a way to create jobs along the way. The recycling law that I helped draft and that was passed in 1988 has created thousands of jobs in Pennsylvania. Right? That's the kind of thing that fosters sustainable development. And so when I came into teaching, my thought was to try and articulate that and then look broadly beyond Pennsylvania at, well, what should the United States be doing? And I've published an article in 1997. That's how it started, out of a seminar here at the law school with students. And we said, well, the Earth Summit is 5 years in the rearview mirror at this point. What's the United States done to live up to the promises that it made? So I published an article based on student papers in my name and in the seminar's name, and we took it up to the UN conference in New York, where we were talking about that, fully expecting that there would be many other people who would be doing the same thing. The Earth Summit was a big deal. It was on the front cover of Time magazine. It was reported amply. And the message that the media reported over and over again was implementation is really important. And yes, the Earth Summit was nice, but let's see what really happens afterwards. So my expectation going to this UN meeting in New York was that there were going to be all sorts of people with a lot of money who would have worked in implementation. And what I found was that there was one guy, me, from a law school in South Central Pennsylvania, who had done the only comprehensive report.
Wow.
Assessing U.S. progress in the first 5 years following the Earth Summit. Only report.
Wow.
That was it. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting. I was disappointed in a way, but I also saw an opportunity. And so for the Rio Plus 10 conference in Johannesburg in 2002, we had a book, Stumbling Towards Sustainability, that wasn't produced by law students. It was produced by experts on various topics, and I edited that book. And the Environmental Law Institute then published another book for Rio Plus 15, and then another for Rio Plus 20, which was the conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. And the Environmental Law Institute is publishing still another assessment of the U.S. that will be publishing the Environmental Law Institute in the next probably 2 months.
Wow. So suffice to say, we've been pretty busy on that front.
Well, yeah, and I think the value of these projects, I mean, you would like to think that there would be a greater public response, but I think the value of these projects is that they highlight what's been done, and there's been actually a lot of progress in particular areas over the last 30 years in the United States, and I think highlighting that is of real value. There's been a significant increase in the use of renewable energy, and it's picking up in a big way lately. You see lots and lots of corporations picking up on sustainable development and making that work. They call this sort of the triple bottom line, if you will. Profits, planet, and people is one way that it's described, and you see a lot of companies doing that. You see a lot of work in higher education where sustainability programs are particularly attractive to younger people who are leaving high school and going and thinking about what kind of lives they want to lead. And then you see it in simple, basic ways like more local and organic food at the restaurants you eat at, almost no matter where you go. And so one would wish that there had been more progress, but there are places where there's been significant progress. And the key, I think, is that there's been more progress where the sustainable alternative is clearly attractive on its own terms. Okay, it makes financial sense, it makes environmental sense, the alternative works well, okay, and that sort of thing. And so where it's attractive on its own terms, I think that's a really helpful thing.
And you sort of read my mind before. I was going to ask you about your time at the Department of Environmental Resources, which is now known as the Department of Environmental Protection. You spent quite a bit of time there. And you mentioned a little bit about how you were able to take what you did there and what you learned there and that knowledge into the classroom. But can you talk a little bit more about how that experience helped you segue into becoming an environmental law professor?
Well, it helps when you're teaching environmental law to have practiced environmental law.
True.
That's a starting point. It's like, do I know what I'm talking about based on real experience? And yes, actually, I do. And that helps, I think. And it helps in a bunch of ways. Part of it is credibility with the law students. Part of it is the ability to tell stories that are relevant. And part of it is just, a sense of what matters. There's a class I've been teaching now for the last 8 or 9 years, a sustainability law practicum class, where students draft model sustainability ordinances or actual sustainability ordinances for specific local governments. And a big piece of that project is drafting. Because I drafted statutes and regulations at the Department of Environmental Resources, I can actually have students do that kind of drafting work and can review and comment on it in a way that I probably almost certainly would not be able to do if I hadn't done that kind of work. I have an idea of when basically drafting a statute or regulation is different than drafting, say, a legal memo or a brief, because every single sentence is a rule. And every single sentence is going to be followed, and so you have to pick your words carefully. And the incorporation of additional words that aren't necessary or the meaning of which you're not clear about, but it sounds good, can really screw up the subsequent interpretation of a particular sentence.
Wow, yeah, and that's something you have to keep in mind when, you're thinking about this and writing about this. Have to, be very clear and concise in your language.
You do, and that it's been fun to be able to do that. It's been a lot of fun to be able to do that.
So would you say that is the class you most enjoy teaching? Would that be one of your favorites?
Well, every class is fun in different ways. when I was teaching property, part of what I enjoyed about teaching property was I just enjoyed teaching for its own sake. It was fun doing exercises and problems. I really enjoyed that. The environmental classes are fun for different reasons. I'm thinking about students who want to do this kind of work in when they graduate from law school, and how you can help them do that. I'm also thinking about for the sustainability class the impact of the draft ordinances in the real world. We had a couple of students draft an ordinance a few years ago about electric car charging, and I got an email this last summer from somebody who's working on it in a particular municipality and said, "This ordinance is really helpful to us. Thank you for having your students do that." We post the best ordinances online here with the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center website, and so they're available to other people, and so that kind of thing is also fun.
In your career, you've also contributed to some landmark judicial decisions here in Pennsylvania, notably ones that significantly strengthen the basic right of Pennsylvanians to a clean environment. And I know that you've also supported similar efforts in Maine and also in New York. And can you talk a little bit about that, in particular, any legal cases of note that you've worked on that come to mind that stand out to you?
Sure, I can do that. Let me go back a little bit to give you sort of a background on this. I learned about public trust doctrine in law school. There was a professor at my law school at the University of Michigan who was active nationally, internationally on the public trust doctrine. His name was Joe Sachs. And the basic idea of the public trust is that there's certain property that ought to be more or less left alone. If you have public property in particular, there's a very strong tendency for private sector folks of one kind or another to figure out a way to appropriate that public property for their own purposes. Mm-hmm. And the idea here basically is that property ought to be protected for its own sake, all right, so that, and not just its own sake, but so that it can be available for the public, all right. The government basically holds this property or protects this property as a trust for present and future generations. That was the idea. And when I came to Pennsylvania, I knew, in 1981, I knew that there had been an environmental rights amendment that included public trust language adopted in Pennsylvania in a decade earlier. But the Pennsylvania courts had buried the amendment so effectively that it really didn't amount to much. And I remember reading it. It was on little frame plaques all over the buildings where I worked that would say our mission, and then it would quoted the Environmental Rights Amendment. Mm-hmm. And I thought, gee, these are really nice words. I wonder what it would mean if the courts treated them like law, because the courts said we're not treating them seriously. So fast forward some years to I'm teaching here, and I'm thinking, well, I wonder what Article 1, Section 27 really means. I wonder what this is all about, and I turned it into a writing project. And what I saw when I did the writing project was that there were these three sentences. The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and the protection of the natural, scenic, and historic values of the environment. That's the first sentence. And the second and third sentences create a public trust. The Commonwealth is responsible for conserving and maintaining public natural resources for the benefit of present and future generations. And I also saw that this is in Article 1 of the state constitution, which is the Declaration of Rights, our analog to the Bill of Rights. So it's not just some random provision about how government ought to protect the environment. It states a right in the people to these things concerning the environment. And it's right there with the right to free speech, the right to a fair trial, the right to bear arms, okay, and the right, if you want to express it in shorthand, to a clean environment. And so I began to compose this article. It turned out to be long. It was a two-part article, and it was published in 1999. And I remember when I talked to people about it at the time, I said, look, the original amendment when this was originally passed, it had a very different meaning than what the courts have done to it. All right?
Mm-hmm.
I am seeing things differently now than I saw if you just look at it through the lens of what of this balancing test that the court used to gut it some years ago. So, but nobody really responded very much to that. There was nothing, and life goes on. And in 2013, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued an opinion in the Robinson Township, in a case called Robinson Township versus the Commonwealth. And in that case, Chief Justice Castile wrote a plurality opinion, a wonderful opinion, that built on the 1999 articles and explained Article 1, Section 27, actually built on and amplified what I said. It's a wonderful opinion. Went back to a lot of the stuff that the original sponsor of the amendment, original advocate and proponent of the amendment, Franklin Curry, had said, and used that to help hold that provisions of the state shale gas legislation were unconstitutional. It was the first time that Article 1, Section 27 had ever been used as a justification for holding a statute unconstitutional. Now, for holding a statute invalid. That's what constitutional provisions do, right? They override contrary provisions of statutes and regulations. But the Environmental Rights Amendment had never been used that way, ever. And then a couple of years later, in another case, the Pennsylvania Environmental Defense Foundation versus the Commonwealth, the Supreme Court built on the Robinson Township plurality, which was only 3 justices out of 7, and turned that into a majority opinion, saying the text of the Constitution matters. And it was a sea change.
Right, that was huge.
It was a sea change. I mean, actually, Justice, then after that, Chief Justice Baird, now sadly deceased, used that exact language, the sea change language, to describe what had happened. And to give you a sense of how big this was, the 3-part balancing test that had gutted the Environmental Rights Amendment and that had been used for more than 40 years was so prominent, was so prevalent, that what you did when you wrote a brief was you would quote the text of the Constitution, but then you'd get to the Payne versus Kassab test, which was the real law. The text of the Constitution never mattered. And so when these cases were decided, lawyers across the state were looking at the text of the Constitution almost literally for the first time.
Wow. That's something.
Almost literally for the first time. And so lately I've been active in filing amicus briefs and continuing to write articles in various cases, trying to articulate, I think, what is a view about how to understand and apply the Environmental Rights Amendment that I think makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing a lot of that kind of advocacy and writing, the advocacy in particular on behalf of the Widener Environmental Law and Sustainability Center. And you see the Widener Environmental Law and Sustainability Center show up over and over again on briefs that I write.
And I know that a lot of that legwork, you've been able to take and help other states. I know Maine in particular was trying to replicate what we have here in Pennsylvania to ensure that, clean water, clean air, clean, sustainability, to protect for generations to come. And, you talked about that public trust. So it sounds like, even beyond what you do here at the law school, you're really keeping a pulse on what's going on in other states and being able to take the work that you've done and help them in those efforts.
Well, what has happened in other states, including, in Maryland, among others, maybe go back a step. Pennsylvania's revitalization of the Environmental Rights Amendment, the 2 cases, particularly in 2013 and 2017, put environmental constitutional provisions on the map in a big way across the country and got a lot of other states to think harder about whether they might want to do the same thing. It also energized advocates for environmental constitutional provisions, Maya Van Rossum, among others, to work harder to advocate adoption of provisions like this in other states. And so you have various places where discussions are occurring about how to do that. My role on that has been to explain to folks in these states the value that I think has been added by Pennsylvania's Environmental Rights Amendment here. I tend not to get too involved in the language drafting or commenting on the language, partly because I think that each state needs to work that out on their own and figure out what really matters to them. But yes, I've had media interviews supporting environmental rights amendments in other states, including New York, and I continue to be engaged in conversations with people in New York and elsewhere about that.
And I know we talked a little bit before about your recent book on helping attorneys incorporate that sustainability into their practice. And I know we touched on it earlier in our conversation, but do you find that there are some practices of law where that's a little bit more challenging, or can it really apply to any area of law practice?
Well, I think it can apply to any area of law practice. And if you think about, use climate change as an example. John Kerry gave a speech to the American Bar Association's annual meeting about a year and a half ago. And he says, whether you want to be or not, you are all climate lawyers now. All right. A real estate practice, for example, might involve building and zoning issues. Well, how close should you build to the river, knowing that we're getting more frequent storms and that floods are more severe than they used to be? All right. In insurance, all right, in dealing with insurance matters, are you going to be able to get insurance on this if you locate in particular places? All right. If you build in Florida, say, what should you adopt? Should you simply follow an old building code, or knowing that hurricanes are getting stronger and more intense, should you be counseling your clients to build more resilient buildings? In supply chain matters, right, where you think you're just doing routine supply chain contract work, the example I mentioned before.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
In of course, environmental and energy law. And so I could multiply the examples across pretty much any area of practice. And a few years ago, I started interviewing lawyers who say that they're doing sustainable development work. And what I was interested in is exactly what are you doing that is different from, say, a conventional environmental law practice or a conventional energy law practice. I wanted to find out if this is an exercise in clever marketing or whether there's a there there. And of course, my gut sense is there is a there there, but I wanted to see what they had to say about that. And one of the things that, yes, there is a there there, but one of the things that these lawyers said, many of them, is that you can take any practice of law, and turn it into a sustainability law practice. That even, if you're, and you do that by figuring out what your client's peers are doing, all right? You look at what your client is doing, you do additional research on that, you figure out, well, if we were going to, what particular aspects of sustainable development are most prominent here? If you're, say, a human resources lawyer at a corporation, how does your diversity, equity, and inclusion work? How is the company's work on that doing? That's included within the social component of sustainable development. The end point of sustainable development, is human quality of life, well-being, freedom, and opportunity. So they're human endpoints, and you need the social, the environmental, and the economic piece, all of them together to make it work. So within whatever legal work you're doing, there's a slice of that where you can advance sustainability and encourage your client to think about doing that.
Now, sometime back, you announced that you will be retiring effective at the end of June of 2023. In our short time together, we've talked a lot about what you've been able to accomplish here in Pennsylvania and beyond. But I understand this could be the beginning of a sort of exciting new chapter for you. What sort of plans do you have? Or are you still sort of working on that?
Well, it's a work in progress.
That's what I thought.
And the starting point, I think, was a sense that the problems that we're dealing with climate in particular, and sustainability more generally, are serious enough that I wanted to spend whatever additional time is in front of me working full-time on that. And I felt pretty strongly about that.
Mm-hmm.
So when people often talk about retirement, it's, we're just going to retire from the real world and have fun. That's not really, so retirement is not a comfortable word for me.
That doesn't surprise me.
And I like, well, I guess I should thank you for that. But my thought is that this is my next act.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And what does the next act look like? A lot of it is continuing what I've been doing in terms of writing, advocacy, scholarship on sustainability and climate change. And some of it, to give you an example, involves the American Bar Association. Like, what are we going to do over the next year, all right, to get ready for COP28 in Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates? All right, what are we going to be doing at the American Bar Association level differently over the course of this year to foster climate-conscious lawyering? And I want to spend more time on that, and now I'll have more time to spend on that.
Well, basically, I think the two words that could sum up your plans: stay tuned. Professor Dernbach, thank you so much for being on our podcast, and certainly for the immense amount of work that you have done, not just here at our law school, but for all the work that you do to continue to help our planet. Suffice it to say, you will definitely be missed, but I have a feeling you will still have quite the presence here at Widener Law Commonwealth. So thank you so much for taking the time out today to talk with us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind words. It's been a privilege.
Absolutely. And thank each of you for listening. And until next time, we'd like to wish you a happy and safe holiday season, and certainly a bright start to 2023.
Widener University Commonwealth Law School is the Pennsylvania capital's only law school, with 3 specialized centers of legal scholarship through its Law and Government Institute, Environmental Law and Sustainability Center, and Business Advising Program. Widener Law Commonwealth offers an exceptional learning experience that is personal, practical, and professional. Visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu for more information.